I never thought I would have to file a police report about my own HOA president. But there I was on a scorching Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, standing in my driveway staring at an empty concrete pad where my vintage 1972 Airstream trailer had been parked for the past 3 years. My name is Marcus Irving, and I had been living peacefully in the Sunset Ridge subdivision for 5 years before everything went sideways. The neighborhood was one of those typical Arizona developments, with stucco houses in various shades of beige and tan, decorative rocks instead of grass, and an HOA that had increasingly become a nightmare under its current leadership. That leadership consisted primarily of one woman named Brenda Patterson, a 52-year-old divorcee with blonde highlights that looked like they had been applied with a paintbrush, and a personality that could curdle milk at 20 paces. I had purchased the Airstream as a project, something to restore in my spare time. It was not in terrible condition when I bought it, just needed some TLC and updates. I had cleared the purchase with the HOA board before bringing it onto my property, received written approval, and had been working on it slowly over the years. The trailer sat on the side of my house behind a wooden fence I had built specifically to keep it from being an eyesore to the neighbors. Everything was by the book, or so I thought. The trouble started about 6 months earlier when Brenda decided she wanted to run the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She had always been somewhat difficult, but after her divorce finalized and she threw herself completely into HOA business, she became insufferable. Every week brought new violations notices for the most ridiculous things. My neighbor got cited because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another family received a fine because their Christmas lights stayed up until January 3rd. It was getting out of hand, but most of us just paid the small fines and moved on with our lives. Then Brenda set her sights on me. It started with a violation notice in my mailbox claiming my trailer was not approved and needed to be removed within 30 days. I immediately pulled out my files and found the approval letter from 3 years ago, signed by the previous HOA president. I made copies and delivered them to Brenda personally at her house, which was a McMansion at the end of our street that she had gotten in the divorce settlement. She barely glanced at the paperwork. "That approval is no longer valid," she said, standing in her doorway in a velour tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "We have new rules now. You cannot just invalidate previous approvals," I replied, keeping my voice level. "That is not how this works." "I have documentation. The board voted to update our policies regarding recreational vehicles and trailers," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You will need to comply or face escalating fines." "When was this vote? I never received notice of any board meeting about this." "It was at last month's meeting. We sent out emails." "I never got an email," she shrugged. "Not my problem. 30 days, Marcus. Get rid of it or the fines start." I went home fuming but determined to handle this properly. I requested copies of the board meeting minutes. I consulted the HOA bylaws and the Arizona HOA laws. I even hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, a sharp woman in her 40s named Patricia Gomez, who had seen cases like mine before. "This is textbook HOA overreach," Patricia told me during our first consultation in her office in Scottsdale. "The previous approval was valid, and they cannot retroactively enforce new rules without proper notice and grandfather clauses. We can fight this." We sent a formal letter to the HOA board outlining why their demand was invalid and why I would not be removing the trailer. We cited specific Arizona statutes and the HOA's own governing documents. For a few weeks, everything went quiet, and I thought maybe Brenda had backed down. I should have known better. The 30th day came and went. On day 31, I received a notice of fine in my mailbox, $500 for non-compliance. I forwarded it to Patricia, who sent another letter. The next week, another $500 fine, and another the week after that. They were adding up fast. "This is harassment," I told Patricia during a phone call. "Can they really just keep fining me like this?" "They can try," she said. "But we are building a case, document everything, take photos, save every piece of correspondence. When this goes to court, we will show a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority." I did exactly that. I photographed my trailer from every angle, documenting that it was behind a fence and not visible from the street. I photographed the approval letter. I created a spreadsheet of every fine and every piece of correspondence. I was meticulous because I knew Brenda was not going to let this go. Then things escalated in a way I never could have predicted. I had been working late at my job as a civil engineer for a construction firm downtown. It was a Thursday evening, and I did not get home until almost 8 o'clock. The Arizona sun was finally setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I pulled into my driveway, tired and ready for a beer and some dinner. That was when I noticed my side gate was open. My stomach dropped. I always kept that gate locked because it led to where I kept my tools and the trailer. I parked quickly and ran to the gate, and that is when I saw the empty concrete pad. The Airstream was gone. Completely gone. For a moment, I just stood there in shock. It was a trailer, sure, but it was not exactly easy to move. Someone would have needed a truck with a proper hitch, the know-how to connect it safely, and the audacity to come onto my property and take it. I immediately called the police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. Officer Rodriguez was a tall Hispanic man with a no-nonsense attitude, and Officer Chen was a younger Asian woman who took detailed notes while I explained the situation. "Any idea who might have taken it?" Rodriguez asked. "I have a pretty good idea," I said, and I explained the whole situation with Brenda and the HOA dispute. "That is quite an accusation," Chen said. "Do you have any proof?" "Not yet, but this did not happen in a vacuum. I have been documenting months of harassment from the HOA president. This is the culmination of that harassment. We will need more than a hunch," Rodriguez said, "but we will file the report. Do you have the VIN number for the trailer?" I did. I had all the documentation for the Airstream, including purchase records, the VIN, and photos. I provided everything to the officers, and they took a full report. They said they would investigate, but I could tell they thought it was a long shot to recover it. After they left, I called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear dinner conversation in the background. "Marcus." "What is wrong?" "The trailer is gone. Someone stole it right off my property." There was a pause. "When?" "Today, sometime between 7 this morning when I left for work and 8 tonight when I got home. I already filed a police report." "And you think it was the HOA? Who else would it be?" "This has been escalating for months." "Okay, listen carefully. Document everything. Take photos of where it was parked, the open gate, any damage to locks or fences. Email me everything tonight. If the HOA took your property, this just became a criminal matter, not just a civil dispute." I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. I photographed everything, wrote down a detailed timeline of events, and sent it all to Patricia. Then I did something else. I checked my security cameras. I had installed a basic security system about a year earlier, just a couple of cameras covering my front door and driveway. They did not have a view of the side yard where the trailer had been, but they did capture the street in front of my house. I pulled up the footage from that day and started scanning through it. At 1:15 in the afternoon, A white Ford F-250 pulling a heavy-duty trailer appeared on screen. It drove slowly past my house, then continued down the street. 20 minutes later, it came back and pulled into my driveway. I could not see the driver clearly because of the angle, but I watched as the truck backed partially out of frame, presumably to where my side gate was located. For the next 45 minutes, the truck stayed there. Then, at 2:47, it pulled back out of my driveway, and now it was clearly pulling my Airstream. The truck turned at the end of the street and disappeared. My heart was pounding as I tried to zoom in on the license plate. The resolution was not great, but I could make out most of the numbers. More importantly, I could see a bumper sticker on the truck. It read, "Sunset Ridge HOA Building Better Communities." I had her. I called the police non-emergency line immediately and explained that I had video footage of the theft. They sent Officer Rodriguez back out, and I showed him the video on my laptop. "Can you enhance that license plate?" he asked, leaning in to look at the screen. "I can try, but I think we can get most of it. And look at this bumper sticker." He nodded slowly. "That is interesting. Can you send me this footage?" "Absolutely. I am going to need to talk to my sergeant about this. If this involves HOA officials, this could get complicated. But you have given us something to work with." Rodriguez left with a copy of the video, and I finally allowed myself to feel a spark of hope. I had evidence. Real, tangible evidence that someone had come onto my property and stolen my trailer in broad daylight. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Patricia. She had watched the video I sent her and had some news. "We need to file an emergency motion in court. What happened constitutes theft, trespass, and possibly conversion. I am also going to demand that the HOA produce records of any contractors or vendors they hired recently, particularly anyone with a truck matching that description. In the meantime, do not engage with Brenda or the HOA board. Let me handle all communication." I agreed and tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. I kept checking my phone, waiting for updates. Around 2 in the afternoon, Patricia called. "You are not going to believe this," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "I filed our motion this morning and included the video. The judge reviewed it and immediately issued an order for the HOA to produce records. More importantly, the police executed a search warrant. A search warrant, already. Apparently, your Officer Rodriguez showed the video to his sergeant, who brought it to the detective division. They moved fast because you had clear evidence of a crime in progress. They went to the HOA's storage facility about an hour ago. And your Airstream was there. Parked in a locked bay that the HOA rents for community equipment. They found it, Marcus. They actually found it." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, so intense that I had to sit down. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. The police are processing it as evidence right now, and they are bringing charges. But here is the best part. Brenda was there when they executed the warrant. She tried to claim she was having the trailer removed for code violations, but when they showed her your approval letter and explained that she had no legal right to remove property from your land, she apparently lost it. She is being charged with theft, criminal trespassing, and criminal damage to property for breaking your gate lock. This is unbelievable. It gets better. 2 other board members were with her, and they are cooperating with police. Apparently, Brenda told them she had the legal right to remove the trailer and that you had been notified. They are now claiming they had no idea she was acting without authority. They are turning on her fast. Over the next few days, the story exploded through our subdivision like wildfire. Everyone was talking about how the HOA president had been arrested for stealing a resident's property. The local news even picked it up because it was such a bizarre story. I watched a clip of Brenda doing a perp walk out of the police station, her face red and furious, screaming about how this was all a misunderstanding, and she was just enforcing HOA rules. My phone rang constantly with neighbors calling to express their support or to share their own horror stories about Brenda's reign of terror as HOA president. It turned out I was not the only one she had been targeting. One elderly couple had been fined thousands of dollars for having a garden gnome that was apparently against HOA aesthetic guidelines. A single mother had been cited repeatedly for her children's toys being visible in the yard. The stories went on and on. The two other board members who had been with Brenda that day, a man named Stephen and a woman named Carol, both resigned immediately and released a public statement claiming they had been misled by Brenda about the legality of her actions. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and Brenda was removed from her position as president. A vote was held, and a much more reasonable neighbor named Tom was elected interim president, but the legal saga was just beginning. My trailer was released back to me after being processed as evidence, though it had sustained some damage during its unauthorized relocation. The hitch had been bent, and there were new scrapes along one side. I documented all of it and sent the information to Patricia. "We are going to sue," Patricia told me during a meeting at her office. "Civil suit for theft, conversion, trespass, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Between the legal fees you have incurred, the damage to your property, and the harassment you have endured, we are looking at substantial damages." What about the HOA itself? Are they liable? That is a good question. Normally, HOAs carry insurance for this kind of thing, but Brenda was acting so far outside her authority that their insurance company might deny the claim, which means the damages could fall on Brenda personally. The criminal case moved forward first. Brenda hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that she was simply enforcing HOA rules and had no criminal intent. But the prosecution had the video, they had my approval letter, they had testimony from the other board members that Brenda had not consulted them before taking the trailer, and they had documentation of the harassment campaign leading up to the theft. The preliminary hearing was a disaster for Brenda. I sat in the courtroom in downtown Phoenix and watched as the prosecutor systematically dismantled her defense. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Martinez, was clearly unimpressed. "Miss Patterson," Judge Martinez said at one point, "you are telling this court that you believed you had the authority to enter someone's private property, break a lock, and remove a trailer worth thousands of dollars without a court order or law enforcement present." "I was enforcing community standards," Brenda said, her voice shaking. "That is not an answer to my question. Did you have a court order?" "No, but the HOA bylaws do not override property rights in criminal law, Miss Patterson. Surely you understand that." Brenda was bound over for trial, and her attorney started making noises about a plea deal. But Brenda, in typical fashion, refused. She insisted she had done nothing wrong and was being persecuted for trying to maintain property values in the neighborhood. While the criminal case proceeded, Patricia filed our civil suit. We sued Brenda personally for $150,000, covering the cost of the trailer repairs, my legal fees, time lost from work, emotional distress, and punitive damages. We also included the HOA as a defendant, arguing that they were liable for Brenda's actions as their president. The HOA's insurance company did exactly what Patricia predicted. They denied coverage, claiming Brenda's actions were outside the scope of her authority and constituted criminal conduct not covered by the policy. This left the HOA in a bind. They could either try to defend themselves, which would cost tens of thousands in legal fees, or they could settle and try to recoup from Brenda. Tom, the new interim president, reached out to me directly. We met at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, and he looked exhausted. "Marcus, I am so sorry about all of this," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I was on the board, but I had no idea what Brenda was doing. None of us did. She was handling most of the violation enforcement herself." "I appreciate that, Tom. I know you were not involved." "The board wants to settle with you. We do not have the money to fight this, and frankly, you are in the right. What happened to you was criminal, and we want to make it right." "What are you proposing?" "We will pay for all your trailer repairs, reimburse your legal fees up to this point, and formally apologize. We will also amend the bylaws to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. We are implementing new oversight procedures and checks on the president's authority." I told him I would discuss it with Patricia. When I did, she advised me that the settlement was reasonable for the HOA portion of the suit, but that we should continue pursuing Brenda personally. "The HOA is basically broke," Patricia explained. "They do not have substantial assets beyond their operating reserves, but Brenda owns her house outright, and it is worth at least $500,000. If we win a judgment against her personally, we can collect." We settled with the HOA for $30,000, which covered my documented expenses and legal fees. They also issued a formal apology at a community meeting and rescinded all the fines they had levied against me. But the suit against Brenda personally continued. Her criminal trial came first. It lasted 3 days, and I was called to testify. I explained the entire timeline, showed the approval letter, and described the harassment campaign. The jury was out for less than 2 hours before coming back with guilty verdicts on all counts: theft, criminal trespass, and criminal damage to property. Brenda sat stone-faced as the verdicts were read. Her attorney asked for leniency during sentencing, claiming she was a first-time offender who had made an error in judgment, but Judge Martinez was having none of it. "Miss Patterson, you abused a position of trust in your community," the judge said during sentencing 2 weeks later. "You harassed a resident, violated his property rights, and committed theft, all while claiming to be acting in the community's interest. Your actions were calculated and deliberate, not an error in judgment. I am sentencing you to 1 year in jail, suspended with 3 years of probation. You will also pay restitution to Mr. Irving in the amount of $10,000 for the criminal damage to his property. If you violate the terms of your probation, you will serve the jail time." Brenda started crying, but I felt no sympathy for her. She had brought this entirely on herself. With the criminal conviction in hand, our civil case became much easier. In Arizona, a criminal conviction for theft can be used as proof in a civil case arising from the same conduct. Brenda's attorney knew this and tried to negotiate a settlement, but Patricia was firm. "Your client stole my client's property and put him through months of harassment," Patricia told the defense attorney during a settlement conference. "We have a criminal conviction. We will win at trial, and the jury will award punitive damages. Your client needs to accept responsibility and pay." Brenda's attorney went back and forth, but eventually, Brenda had to face reality. She did not have $150,000 in liquid assets. She had her house, which was worth about $520,000, with about $200,000 in equity after the divorce settlement, some retirement accounts, and that was about it. We went to trial on the civil case 6 months after the criminal conviction. The trial lasted 2 days, and the jury awarded me $135,000 in damages, including $50,000 in punitive damages. It was less than we had asked for, but more than enough to send a message. Brenda tried to negotiate a payment plan, but I was done being patient with her. Patricia filed to execute on the judgment, which meant we could force the sale of Brenda's assets to satisfy the debt. We placed a lien on her house. "You cannot do this," Brenda screamed at me when we ran into each other at the courthouse while filing the lien paperwork. "You are ruining my life over a stupid trailer. You stole my property," I said calmly. "You broke into my yard, took something that did not belong to you, and tried to justify it by abusing your position. You did this to yourself." She tried to appeal the judgment, but her appeal was denied. With interest and legal fees accruing, the total she owed me grew to over $140,000. She could not refinance the house because her credit was destroyed from the legal judgments. She could not afford to keep paying the mortgage and the probation fees and her living expenses while also trying to satisfy the judgment. 8 months after the judgment was entered, Brenda put her house on the market. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was devastated, claiming I had destroyed her life. But I felt no guilt. She had created this situation through her own actions. The house sold after 3 months on the market for $510,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage, the real estate fees and other costs, there was about $190,000 left. My judgment took $142,000 of that, leaving Brenda with less than $50,000 from the house she had fought so hard to keep in her divorce. I received the payment via wire transfer on a Tuesday afternoon in September. I was sitting at my desk at work when Patricia called to tell me the money had cleared. "It is over," she said. "You got your full judgment plus interest and fees. Congratulations, Marcus. You won." I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired. The whole ordeal had taken nearly 2 years from start to finish. 2 years of stress, legal meetings, court dates, and constantly looking over my shoulder. But there was also satisfaction. Brenda had thought she could bully me into submission, that she could use her position of authority to violate my rights, and that there would be no consequences. She had been spectacularly wrong. The Airstream was fully repaired and looked better than ever. I had used some of the settlement money from the HOA to hire a professional restoration company, and they had done beautiful work. The trailer gleamed in my side yard, a testament to the fact that justice, while slow, could still prevail. The neighborhood changed after Brenda left. Tom remained as HOA president and ran it with actual common sense. Fines were reserved for genuine violations that affected safety or property values, not petty aesthetic complaints. Communication improved, and residents actually started attending meetings again because they were not afraid of being ambushed with violations. I ran into Carol, one of the former board members, at the grocery store about a year after everything was resolved. She approached me cautiously in the produce section. "Marcus, I just wanted to say again how sorry I am about everything that happened," she said. "I should have pushed back more against Brenda. I could see she was getting out of control, but I did not want to make waves." "I appreciate that, Carol. I know you were not the driving force behind any of it. Still, I enabled it by not speaking up. A lot of us did. We have learned from this, though. The new board has actual oversight now. We review every violation before it goes out, and we require documentation for everything. What Brenda did could never happen now." "That is good to hear. That is how it should work." She nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it is worth, I am glad you fought back. A lot of people would have just moved or given in. You stood up for what was right, and it made a difference for everyone here." That conversation stuck with me, because the truth was, I had thought about moving. During the worst of the harassment, when the fines were piling up and Brenda seemed untouchable, I had seriously considered just selling and leaving. It would have been easier in some ways, but it also would have been wrong. I had done nothing wrong, and I was not about to be driven from my home by someone abusing their authority. Standing up to Brenda had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but it had also been necessary. Not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been suffering under her petty tyranny. The legal victory sent a message that resonated beyond just our subdivision. Patricia told me she had been contacted by several other HOA dispute clients who had heard about the case. The local news coverage meant that other HOA boards in the Phoenix area were now aware that they could face serious consequences for overstepping their authority. I kept working on the Airstream, slowly bringing it back to its full vintage glory. It became a labor of love, something I could focus on that had nothing to do with lawyers or courts or HOA drama. I would spend weekend mornings out there, sanding and polishing and upgrading, with classic rock playing from a portable speaker. My neighbors would sometimes stop by to check on the progress. The Airstream became something of a neighborhood landmark, which was ironic considering it had been at the center of so much conflict. But now people appreciated it. They would ask about the restoration, compliment the work, and share their own stories about vintage trailers or RVs they had owned. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 years after the whole mess started, I was putting the finishing touches on the interior upholstery when Tom walked up my driveway. "Marcus, got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, what is up? The board has been talking, and we wanted to do something to acknowledge what happened and make sure the community knows we have changed. We are planning a neighborhood block party next month, and we would like to feature your Airstream as a centerpiece. Maybe put up a little plaque about the importance of respecting property rights. What do you think?" I considered it. Part of me wanted to just move on and forget the whole thing. But another part of me recognized that this was an opportunity to turn something negative into something positive. "I will do it on one condition," I said. "No plaque about me or what happened. But I will bring the Airstream and give tours, and maybe we can have someone from a local HOA advocacy group there to talk to residents about their rights. Make it educational." Tom grinned. "That is perfect. I will set it up." The block party was a huge success. Nearly every household in the subdivision turned out. I gave dozens of tours of the restored Airstream, and people were genuinely impressed with the work. A lawyer from a tenant and homeowner advocacy organization set up a table with information about HOA rights and responsibilities. Several residents stopped by to learn more, and a few even shared their own stories of HOA disputes. It felt good to turn what had been such a negative experience into something constructive. The Airstream that Brenda had tried to use as a weapon against me was now a symbol of standing up for your rights and holding authorities accountable. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Brenda had moved to Tucson and was working some administrative job. She had declared bankruptcy not long after being forced to sell her house, trying to discharge some of her other debts. My judgment was not dischargeable because it arose from willful and malicious conduct, but I had been paid in full, so it did not matter much to me what she did after that. Part of me wondered if she had learned anything from the experience. Had she reflected on how her need for control and her abuse of authority had cost her everything? Or did she still see herself as the victim, persecuted for trying to maintain standards? I would probably never know, and honestly, I did not care anymore. What mattered was that justice had been served. It had taken 2 years, cost more in legal fees than I like to think about even with the reimbursement, and aged me considerably, but the system had worked. Brenda had been held accountable criminally and civilly. She had lost her position, her reputation, and her home. The consequences were proportionate to her actions. More importantly, the HOA had been reformed. Real oversight existed now. Residents knew their rights. The culture of fear and petty enforcement that Brenda had created was gone, replaced by a more collaborative and reasonable approach to community management. I finished the Airstream restoration about 6 months after the block party. It was perfect, everything I had envisioned when I first bought it. The aluminum exterior gleamed. The interior was a beautiful mix of restored vintage elements and modern updates, and mechanically it was sound. I took it on a shakedown trip up to Flagstaff, camping in the Ponderosa Pines and enjoying the cool mountain air. Sitting by the campfire that evening, looking at the trailer that had caused so much trouble, I felt a sense of peace. The whole ordeal with Brenda and the HOA had been terrible while it was happening, but it had taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, about not backing down when you are in the right, and about the importance of accountability. I thought about all the people who do back down when faced with similar situations. How many homeowners pay unjust fines or comply with invalid demands because fighting seems too hard or too expensive? How many Brendas are out there right now, drunk on their tiny bit of authority, making life miserable for their neighbors? My case had made a difference, at least locally. Other HOA boards in the area had taken notice. Residents in other subdivisions had reached out to me through social media, asking for advice on their own disputes. I had become an accidental activist for HOA reform, which was not something I had ever planned, but something I had grown to accept. Patricia and I stayed in touch. She would occasionally send me news articles about other HOA cases, or updates on legislation being proposed to reform HOA laws in Arizona. The state was considering a bill that would require HOAs to carry insurance specifically covering abuse of authority claims and would create faster dispute resolution processes for homeowners. It was nicknamed the Brenda Bill in some circles, which made me laugh. Life returned to normal, or at least a new normal. I still lived in the same house in Sunset Ridge. The HOA was functional and reasonable. My neighbors were friendly. The Airstream sat in my side yard, now a source of pride rather than conflict. On the 3-year anniversary of the day I came home to find the trailer stolen, I was sitting on my back patio with a beer, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant colors. My phone rang. It was Officer Rodriguez, who I had stayed in occasional contact with. "Marcus, hope I am not bothering you," he said. "Not at all. What is up?" "I am teaching a class at the police academy about property crimes and investigations, and I wanted to use your case as an example. The way you documented everything, the security footage, your organized records, it all made our job so much easier. Would you be willing to come talk to the cadets about it from a victim's perspective?" "Sure, I can do that." "Great. And hey, I wanted you to know that your case changed some of our procedures. We now take HOA disputes more seriously as potential criminal matters. Your situation opened a lot of eyes around here about how badly these disputes can escalate." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about how one person's actions could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Brenda had stolen my trailer thinking she was untouchable, that her authority as HOA president gave her the right to do whatever she wanted. Instead, she had set in motion a chain of events that had reformed an HOA, changed police procedures, inspired potential legislation, and cost her everything. There was a certain poetic justice in that. I never saw Brenda again after that confrontation at the courthouse. I heard occasional updates through the grapevine. She had tried to join the HOA board in her new Tucson development and had been rejected once the residents there Googled her name and found the news articles. She had apparently learned nothing from the experience and was trying to tell anyone who would listen that she had been wrongly persecuted. Some people never change, I guess. They are so convinced of their own righteousness that they cannot see how their actions affect others. Brenda was one of those people. She had genuinely believed that her vision of what the neighborhood should be was more important than anyone's property rights or personal autonomy. That belief had destroyed her life, and she still could not see it. But that was not my problem anymore. I had fought my fight, won my victory, and moved on. The Airstream was mine, fully restored and perfect. My home was mine, free from harassment and unjust fines. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that I had stood up to a bully and won, not just for myself but for my entire community. The sun was setting completely now, the sky fading from orange to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The desert air was starting to cool. I finished my beer and went inside, closing the door on that chapter of my life once and for all. Justice had been served. The criminal had been convicted. The damages had been paid. And I had my trailer, my property, and my peace of mind back. Sometimes when you stand up for what is right, the system actually works. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes perseverance, but it can work. That was the real lesson of the whole ordeal. Not that HOAs are evil or that all board presidents are corrupt, but that accountability matters. That property rights matter. That you cannot just take what you want and call it enforcement. That actions have consequences, no matter how important you think you are. Brenda had learned that lesson the hard way, and while I took no pleasure in her downfall, I also had no regrets about holding her accountable. She had stolen my property, violated my rights, and tried to bully me into submission. She deserved everything that happened to her, and my Airstream. It was beautiful, a rolling piece of American history restored to glory. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded not of the theft or the legal battles, but of the fact that I had fought for what was mine and won. That was a good feeling, one that no amount of money or vindication could diminish. The neighborhood continued to thrive under new leadership. Property values actually increased after the reforms, which was ironic since Brenda had claimed her strict enforcement was necessary to maintain values. Turns out, people are willing to pay more to live in a community where they are treated with respect, and common sense prevails over petty tyranny. I eventually started dating someone I met through the whole ordeal, actually. Helen Anderson was a reporter who had covered the story for one of the local news stations. We ran into each other at a coffee shop several months after the trial, started talking, and hit it off. She found the whole situation fascinating from a journalistic perspective, and I appreciated her intelligence and sense of humor. "You know what the best part of this whole story is?" she asked me one evening over dinner. "What is that?" "You are probably the only person in America who can say their vintage Airstream restoration project led to meaningful HOA reform. That is a hell of a legacy." She was right. It was not the legacy I had planned or wanted, but it was meaningful nonetheless. And sitting there with Helen, talking about life and future plans, and where we might take the Airstream on our next adventure, I realized that sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best outcomes. Brenda Patterson had tried to take something from me, and in the process, she had lost everything while I gained more than I had lost. That was not revenge, it was just natural consequences playing out. She had planted seeds of abuse and harassment, and she reaped a harvest of criminal conviction, civil judgment, and personal ruin. Meanwhile, I had my home, my restored trailer, a new relationship, and the respect of my community. I had stood up to someone who thought they were untouchable and proved them wrong. And perhaps most importantly, I had helped ensure that what happened to me would be less likely to happen to others. That Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, when I came home to an empty concrete pad, seemed like a lifetime ago now. The shock and violation I had felt in that moment had been real and profound. But I had channeled that into action, into fighting back through proper legal channels, into holding someone accountable for their crimes. The system is not perfect. It took too long and cost too much. There were times I wanted to give up, times I wondered if it was worth the fight. But in the end, justice prevailed. The criminal was convicted, the damages were paid, the reforms were implemented, and I got to keep my trailer and my dignity. As I sat there that evening, 3 years removed from the theft that had upended my life, I felt grateful. Grateful for Patricia's legal expertise. Grateful for Officer Rodriguez's diligence. Grateful for neighbors who had supported me. Grateful for a legal system that, despite its flaws, had ultimately delivered justice. And maybe, in some small way, I was even grateful to Brenda. Not for what she did, but for what her actions had revealed. About the importance of accountability. About the need for HOA reform. About the value of standing up for your rights. She had meant to hurt me, to punish me for not bowing to her authority. Instead, she had inadvertently made me stronger and made my community better. That was the real victory. Not the money, not even the criminal conviction, but the positive change that came from fighting back against injustice. Brenda Patterson had stolen my trailer, but in doing so, she had set in motion events that had transformed a community and inspired reform. She had lost everything trying to take something that was never hers to take, and me. I had my Airstream, my home, my peace of mind, and the knowledge that when it mattered most, I had stood up and fought back. That was worth more than any judgment or settlement could ever be. The stars were coming out now, bright and clear in the desert sky. Somewhere in my side yard, the Airstream sat gleaming in the moonlight, a symbol of perseverance and justice. Tomorrow, I would get up and go to work and live my life. The drama was over. The battles were won. The only thing left was to enjoy the peace that comes after the storm. And that is exactly what I intended to do.